Yo, I'm Sigjir, and today we're going to be talking about kick drums, specifically synthesizing kicks. So I'd like to start off by playing a beat for you that is totally synthesized and in MIDI. There is a snare and a hi-hat for context, but I want you to listen to the kick drum here. So that sounds like a kick to me, and it occupies the space that it should be occupying. We're going to dive into this and see what makes a kick a kick. Something to note before we get started, in this monitor up here, I am using Vision's 4X plugin, and I actually forget who makes SciScope, but those will be the two plugins I will be using to look at and meter what we're designing. I believe Vision 4X might have a free or a light version that you could pick up. And then I know SciScope, I think, is totally free. I'm using a free version, but I highly recommend both of those plugins. I use them in every project I work on. So we're going to dive into these kicks, and I'm going to predominantly show you how to do this in Serum, but these principles and concepts will translate to any synth that you're using to create your kick drum. So for reference, I've also created a kick using Vital, and this is the beat with the Vital kick. There are some differences, but I would say these are differences in character of the kick itself. Not every waveform is the same, and every event doesn't happen the same exact way. So yes, they are slightly different, but at the same time, that also occupies the space that a kick should, and it holds the same characters. So you can synthesize kicks in numerous VSTs. Some, to name a few, are Serum and Vital, which I will be going over today. You can also do this in something like a phase plant or Kick 2. Or if you have a native or stock synthesizer that you really like within your DAW, you can do that as well. Ultimately, you just need oscillators and maybe a sampler. So let's dive into creating a kick in Serum. If I start on my track, we are going to start off with an initialized preset. Now, I like to think of kicks as using multiple layers in frequency and also in time. And those things are separate, but they also coexist simultaneously. I like to think of kicks in layers, and those layers can happen in frequency and they can happen over time. So, for instance, a transient and a tail combined and layered together become a kick drum, and low, mid, and high frequencies layered together become a kick drum. Two separate thought processes, let's say, but they have to coexist simultaneously. And it's the combination and the result of everything occurring that creates what we hear as a kick drum. So we're going to start by loading in basic shapes, because all we're doing is looking for a sine wave. You can design this in the wavetable editor if you'd like. If you have a custom wavetable with the sine wave, feel free to use that. I have some, but basically we just need to start with a sine wave because we're going to be synthesizing a clean fundamental. This fundamental ideally will exist in mono. We don't want it to be we don't want the transient to be in stereo because that will cause issues down the line in our mix. And we don't want it to have extra or unwanted harmonics on the waveform. Now, sine waves are theoretical. They don't truly exist in nature because they consist of just the fundamental frequency with no added harmonics. Once you start adding harmonics, you are no longer in sine wave territory. Something like a hardstyle kick or a gabber kick could be something where, maybe you use a square wave. But for what we're trying to do, we're trying to create a good, clean kick that can act as a base layer for added samples, or maybe just it's going to be a solo kick itself, but we want it to be clean and it should not have unwanted overtones or harmonics in it. So the first thing we need to start with here is by creating a click. We need that click for our transient to get our transient to kind of cut through in the mix. And the way I like to do that, I'll be showing you two ways. The first way is with an LFO. You can use these envelopes. I prefer not to because they're a lot less flexible compared to the LFO. The LFOs, you can draw in all kinds of weird shapes with different tensions and timings and all that, and the envelopes are kind of just static envelopes. So we're going to drop our attack all the way down to 0 ms, milliseconds, because we need this sound to trigger immediately, and therefore that will emphasize our click sound that we're designing. So if we take a listen, we already hear a little bit of a click. We lose that if we increase our attack. So we're starting with a click, or we're starting at 0 milliseconds for our attack. You can add some release if you want. I tend to keep the release shorter. I don't want the sound to linger more than it needs to. In regards to drum and bass, everything's moving pretty fast, and we need to occupy the minimum amount of time and space possible in order to create room for the other things. So the first thing we're going to do, or the first method for creating a click, is we're going to take LFO1 and set it to envelope mode, so it triggers and plays once. It doesn't re-trigger at all. We're going to turn the BPM mode off. We're not going to sync to the DAW. And we're going to just increase the rate to as fast as it goes, which is 100 Hertz in this case. We're going to go into the matrix, and we are going to select our LFO1. We're going to go to global and set the master tune, or the master pitch of the synthesizer. I like to turn the amount all the way up for now, and we will dial that back in once we're actually sculpting and designing our kick. Now, the type over here is the type of modulation, meaning it's either going to be bipolar or unipolar. We want our modulation to be unipolar. The reason why is because we want to create that click, we're going to create a very, very fast, nearly inaudible pitch mod. And the result of that pitch mod will create the click sound. In order to do that, we only want to move in a positive direction. If we move in a positive and negative direction, we're actually going to not get what we're trying to do. So in this case, we're going to have a unipolar pitch mod. It's going to the master tune, and it's being, the source is LFO1 that's doing it. So if we listen now, we have this click. If we made it longer, you can kind of hear it's not a click anymore. It kind of has like a laser sound almost. Right, we don't want that. We want it to be almost inaudible. So it's just that click. Okay, so we've created our click with method 1. The second method, let's bypass this LFO. The second method would be adjusting your phase. Now I'm going to dissect the phase when you're designing drums shortly, but something to note here is that you can see our phase is starting in the middle of our waveform. So even though it says 180, we're kind of starting at 0. And what's happening is we're starting at an amplitude of 0, and then we're traveling over time, and we hit this peak up here, and then we're traveling over more time, and we're coming back down. And if you imagine this waveform to keep going on, which is being showed here, we're recycling, and we hit this trough down here, and then we ascend back up to our origin point. If we need to create a click, and for some reason we can't create this ultra-fast pitch modulation, we can take our phase, and typically if you shift it 90 degrees in a direction to the highest peak or the lowest trough, we will hear a click. So you could dial this knob in. I'm just going to double click, type in 90, and, I'm going to double click and type in 270 because 180 plus 90 is 270. you can see that puts us right here, the highest peak on our waveform. And now you should hear a click. Something else we need to address that's very important in Serum and Vital and any other synth that has randomizing parameters is we need to turn down this random phase knob. We don't need to randomize where we're starting at in the waveform for drums because we need consistent, reliable hitting transients. So now we can hear that click audibly every time. So that is the second way to design a click for your transient within Serum. You can also do this in Vital or Phase Plant or any other synth. Moving forward, just assume you can do these things in most synthesizers. So I'm going to reset my phase and I'm going to reactivate my master tune. We have our click. Now, the next thing we need is a second pitch mod. This pitch mod is really the punch or the oomph that we're going to get that makes that kick sound. And I have learned over time that a specific shape really helps accentuate that. I'm going to turn the DAW syncing off, or syncing with my DAW off on the rate or the speed of these LFOs every time. All of these are going to be in envelope mode. We're not going to retrigger. We don't have a reason to retrigger. And then there are some macros we're going to set a little bit later that I think are a lot easier to manage when you have the BPM sync set to off and it's just operating in hertz. So why don't we drop this down to just 5 hertz or something like that. And we're going to map this to the coarse pitch of oscillator A. Now, if you want to change this modulation, you can do this here or in the matrix. But right here on this knob, we can see this is where I drag and drop the modulation. If I want to change this, I can hold down Alt, Shift, and left click to switch it from unipolar to bipolar or bipolar to unipolar. What I just did was switched it from bipolar to unipolar. What you can also do is go into the matrix like we did with our first modulation, and we can switch the type here. So again, we want to have a unipolar modulation. It's going to happen here. Now, if we take a listen, we should hear a little bit more oomph now because we're using a similar pitch mod at a slower rate. So we're kind of getting a And if we play with that modulation, we can kind of sculpt out a little bit more punch. If you go too high and the pitch mod's too slow, you kind of get this laser effect that I'm not very fond of. Some genres like to lean into that, but I always try to avoid that, just my particular taste. That sound, kind of call that like a laser shot, laser stab. I don't like that, so I avoid that. Okay, so if we start playing with our LFO shape, we kind of get something that resembles a kick. Now what we need is a third LFO. And this LFO will be our kick amplitude or volume. And this is going to also be in envelope mode, and same deal. We're going to set this to something in hertz, something a little bit faster. So the shape of this really matters. And specifically, it's the relation between the shape of the pitch modulation and the volume modulation. So if we aren't careful with what shapes we're using and how we've kind of sculpted these out, they will actually work against each other. Meaning, if my volume modulation is too fast, you can hear that the pitch modulation actually doesn't have enough time to get through itself. before the volume goes away. So you always want to be mindful of these things, and I would argue when you're designing your kick, at some point go back and revisit the shapes and the relation between the shapes just to make sure everything is still hitting the way it should. I like that, so I think we're going to stick with that. Now, the next thing we're going to do is actually work on the top layer. And the reason why is because this would be what I would call a clean kick drum, which could be layered in with something like an acoustic kick drum or a sample of a kick drum, and this could all work. So the middle information kind of holds all the characters, so we're going to hold off on a lot of that middle information and try to just make something that can work with anything, and then I'll show you how to address the mid. So it's important to note that in Serum, at least, the samples are all in mono. So I've loaded in my own stereo samples. In this case, it's white noise, just stereo white noise that I created in a generator in my DAW. You can do this in any DAW or grab a sample from anywhere. You can drag and drop it into the oscillator, or you can load it into the folder in the directory for Serum. I can cover that in a different video. If it's something that you're interested in, just let me know in the comments. The important thing here is that we want stereo noise to help occupy the stereo field and get some width on our kick. So randomizing the phase, same deal. We want to take this down. I do want to change the phase start position. It will always start from this position, but I tend to use this particular sample on a lot of different sources when I'm working. So I might use this on a snare and a hi-hat and maybe on a bass or something like that. And by randomizing that start point, it avoids my sounds from getting too stale because I'm kind of baking this same source sample into everything. We don't want to create something boring. So we're kind of creating the illusion of movement, but it's for the sake of clean engineering. We're not actually moving everything. So we're going to pull the volume all the way down and use LFO4 to sculpt out what we would call a hit. So same deal, envelope mode, and we are here in, we're unsynced to the DAW. And you can hear right now, that doesn't really sound like a kick drum. This shape will have to be sculpted into something that actually has the quality of the beater or something hitting the surface of the kick drum head. That's what we're trying to emulate. Now, I always like to account for the transient that we work so hard to establish by not only creating some attack, but creating like a stall before our attack even happens. So in this case, you know, if you really want to measure things and get into it, 10 milliseconds is kind of like a safe number of where, you know, if you're waiting 10 milliseconds, you can usually sculpt out enough space to avoid a click. I'm not really going to look at meters and check and measure to make sure I'm you know, I have a 10 millisecond head start here. I'm just going to listen and hear if the noise is playing with the click. If it's not, then we're good. So if we're here, you can hear the click is lost and everything. But if I start pulling this forward, I can hear that click. So next we would start drawing and shaping this LFO. Now, the reason I'm not using something just like a pluck or a down ramp is because we talked about how the sine wave is a theoretical waveform because it's just a pure fundamental. we kind of have to think of a similar concept when it comes to creating these LFOs. Something like this, like the click LFO, the reason why it's just a perfect triangle or like a down ramp is because the effect is inaudible, the result is audible. So when we get into these complex LFOs, what we're actually trying to do is create these minor imperfections, which is what actually happens in the world. So when a beater hits a drum head, it's not a perfect moment of friction. There's imperfections and some, chaotic elements that cause the sound to travel in a way where the result actually ends up being pleasing to us. And so, this sound here, we're kind of trying to emulate that friction that happens. And sometimes, maybe the beater hits the drum head and maybe your foot was a little bit tired. So you kind of, slightly tapped it second time and almost created like a ghost hit with it. Or maybe you hit too hard and you held the beater on for 3 milliseconds too long and that muffled it in a way. That's what we're trying to emulate or create here. I'm not spending a lot of time trying to build a career around that. I kind of just get to a point where something sounds good enough to me and then I move on. So don't get lost in the sauce, but do try to create some kind of clean imperfection. And I'm actually going to turn on a high pass filter here and apply it to the noise. And we're really just, I want to cut out if there's some sub frequencies in there. You could always pre-process this sample and not have to do that. I haven't done it with this. So that's the only difference. And this is essentially a kick drum. Something I would do here is I want to address the macros that we will be using, because I think these macros will allow you to get more samples or more options out of one patch instead of having to download 30 presets or 300 samples from somewhere and scour them hoping for the one that fits your project. You can take one preset and get 300 samples out of it and just make them as you need them. So the first macro I'm going to call speed, and I'll turn it all the way up just so we can hear it as we're applying it. But speed is just going to apply to the rate of the LFO. And in this case, now you can see it's a little bit easier to do this when you're unsynced to the DAW. If this was synced to the DAW, when I start turning it up, it's not gradually increasing, it's snapping to the next time increment in Serum. So it's going from a half bar to half bar to a quarter beat, then to an eighth beat, and then if you had the triplets and the dotted notes selected too, it would be snapping to all of those. Instead, we want to just snap through real time, so to speak. So I have this all the way up, and then I will just start to pull this back until I hear something where the kick has not quite left, but it's certainly not the same sound as the initial. We'll turn this noise off just to hear the oscillator A. Something like the amount of 23 works. Then we'll go to the rate of our volume modulation and do the same thing. Okay. Then we will turn on our noise and we will do the same thing. And the reason we're doing this is because we want to account for variations. We want to get as much as we can out of this patch. So if I start at 0 and I gradually increase, you'll hear the different kicks. Some of the possibilities for something like this are in a build-up. Maybe you need a kick roll or something where you're going to have a bunch of kicks stutter and they need to shorten to build tension. maybe we're going to try to mimic a real drum kit, and you're going to try to create the illusion of a ghost hit happening, so the kick needs to be softer. Maybe you have some other creative idea and you want to do that. You can always play around with parameters and do something like that. But the point is that these macros really open up micro adjustments for us without having to bounce and reprocess a kick every time. Especially if you're, all the way through a project and you're mixing something down and you realize the kick doesn't work. You don't have to go back to the beginning and start from scratch with the kick drum. You can turn a couple of knobs, and ideally that solves the situation. So the other macro that we can add is something that I like to call beater, i.e. the drum beater. And this will just kind of increase the impact and the audibility of the beater hitting that drum head. And for now, we will just apply that to the level of the noise. And we want this to be very subtle. Maybe a little bit of drive on the filter as well. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to address here is the mid-level of a kick. And in this case, we're going to use the wavetable analog BD syn or sine. This is something like a sine wave, but not. It is sine-esque. There are other harmonics in this wavetable. So we can see that, yes, this is, sine-like, but not a true sine. And you could do this with, you don't have to use this wavetable specifically. Again, we're just looking for something that could be clean, but is a little bit more dirty because we want more middle information. I'm going to add oscillator B to this filter, this high pass, just to create some space here. Let's listen. Okay, so nothing special here. Same deal, we'll turn the randomizing of the phase position down. And the other thing we need to pay attention to is the phase of our second waveform. So our phase is at 0. If you look here, we are actually doing something negative to our kick. We are negatively impacting not only the transient, but just the overall sound of the kick. As our first sine wave, our oscillator A sine wave is hitting a peak, our oscillator B sine wave is actually hitting a trough. And those two sine waves are counteracting each other and canceling and making the kick a lot weaker than it should be. So to correct this, I'm going to shift the phase of the waveform to 0. You could potentially shift it in a different direction. I'm not saying that every single time the phase needs to start this way. Make sure they're layering up in a way that is not negatively impacting your sound. So now, you can hear we have that entire sound. The next thing we're going to do here is maybe add a little bit of pitch modulation. Unipolar pitch modulation, similar to what we did with oscillator A, to oscillator B. So let's take a listen. You can hear we have a little bit tack on there. It's kind of giving us some more punch. Now, we're going to turn the volume all the way down, and we're going to apply an LFO to oscillator B. And this is going to be very similar to what we did with the noise oscillator. We're going to create a shape that is staggered and delays slightly in envelope mode and unsynced to the DAW. And this is going to sort of try to exist shortly after the transient to create that body for the tail. You can always add a little bit of modulation to the drive of the filter. Okay, so if we turn our oscillator back on, should sound something like that. And then the other thing we can do is map our speed macro to this to have it line up. Okay, next thing we'll do is turn our noise oscillator back on and use FM from noise. And this is where the beater macro comes in. So I like to find a sweet spot first where the mid layer is just a little dirty. And why don't we bypass our noise volume modulation. Maybe around 31. And then we'll apply the beater macro to our noise FM on oscillator B. Okay, so altogether, if we start tuning this thing, tweaking the macros, now we have something that sounds like a kick. And this is all before we have done any kind of effects processing, which I'm actually going to say that I tend to not use these effects more than I do, at least in regards to drums. I try to get everything sounding good and present and punchy without doing anything to it, and then in the end, if I need to, I can. But if you get it sounding as good as the sound can be right out of the gate, then it's going to make your job easier down the road. We could try maybe a little bit of soft clipping or something, but I've noticed that it takes away from the character or it creates unwanted character, so I tend to not do this. We could try modulating this. And I'm not going to do it because I feel like squashing that signal is kind of taking away some loudness or some perceived loudness. So I would leave this as is and call this a kick drum, and we could hear it in our beat to test and see if it sounds like a kick. And I think that works. Now, I want to show you a couple of bonus things before we wrap up here, but just to show you that this is not exclusive to Serum, I've done something very similar, if not the same, in Vital, where I have our two waveforms, and you can see this is a basic shapes, but it's just a sine wave, and then I have a slightly different sine wave kind of scrolling through here for some overtones, and our sampler is running some white noise. The rest of these are just pitch mods and volume mods, and I've created a little speed macro here to kind of adjust the rate if I need to. And a filter just kind of cleaning up some of the low frequencies to make space for the low end of the kick drum. Not doing any post effects. I would probably handle dynamics after this outside of the VST. I like to use a compressor and a clipper of some sort to control that stuff, but that will be a different video. And that is really how I handle synthesizing kick drums. Now, something I do want to touch on real quick is velocity and dynamic EQ. This can make your kick have a little bit more character, work a bit more efficiently, and more importantly, it can keep the sound from becoming boring and stale. Now, the velocities, I have these mapped to the rates of LFO 3, 4, and 5. And all that means is that we have our volume LFO we have our oscillator B, volume LFO, and we have our noise, volume LFO. And all we're doing here with this velocity is changing the speed at which the LFO happens, which is therefore affecting the shape. And that speed is just kind of creating these different characters or different characteristics in each hit, like a ghost hit or as if a drummer was really hitting. These kicks that happen in fast succession, you wouldn't hit the kick drum perfectly with the beater every single time. Your foot might get tired, it might slip, you might, we're humans, and by human nature, imperfections kind of are the name of the game. You can hear this beat really loses its character if you don't have velocity. This kind of just sounds like, lazy finger drumming, or, it almost sounds like sampling in a way. It sounds like I just don't have any other options. And what I want with my digital drums, at least, is I want my digital drums to still have realistic qualities. And so by adding these velocities, we get these different variations on the kick. And one thing to note on these velocities is I changed the ramp or the shape of the velocity mapping. And the reason why is because you have to, if you start with this down ramp, I've noticed it's a little bit easier to manage that way. And it starts with kind of going into the positive direction rather than the negative direction in terms of the modulation. And then the other thing is that if we don't like what we've done, or if we need to adjust it for a project, we can tweak the tension of this shape or the curve, and then this will change the velocities to be more drastic or less drastic, depending on what we need. So you can hear when we're kind of increasing everything, we're almost fully kind of removing those velocities. But I'll just reset that to somewhere in the middle, because that's what I want for this. Now, the next thing and the last thing I want to touch on here before we wrap up is dynamic EQ, and how dynamic EQ can make something like a kick or a drum or really any sound more interesting. Now, you can do this in something like a Pro Q, like a Pro Q3 or Pro Q4, or I think it was, I don't remember what version they started introducing it, but you can do it that way. You can use another dynamic EQ of your choice, or a way that I like doing it that I think gets the job done is to use a stock EQ in your DAW where you can just add bands and you map an LFO or an envelope or something to it, maybe an envelope follower. You map that to the gain of the bands. And you can see here with this on, these bands will start moving and interacting in a way that I've programmed. And so if we loop these drums, you can kind of hear with and without. It might not be a big difference to you, but it's a big difference to me. And it just keeps that kick drum from getting stale and boring. So with it, without, so that's something else that you can think about, is using dynamic EQ and mapping an LFO, or if you're in a plugin, really focusing on getting some of those bands moving in a pleasing way, because we might like a frequency, but we might not like a frequency consistently over time. So maybe it just needs to exist at one point. I will say, if you're doing something like this, be very mindful of the low frequencies. If you're using something like a Pro Q3 or 4, I'm not going to say make sure you always have it set to linear phase mode, because often enough, linear phase mode does not need to be on all the time. I know that's a hot subject for debate. I believe whatever their default mode is, I think it's called zero latency, maybe. Zero latency linear phase, and natural phase. You just want to avoid natural phase. Sometimes linear phase is the correction you need to keep your sound in phase and sounding all right, but they do factor that in for natural phase, or at least they say they do in the manual. So maybe play between both of those methods, but you just want to be sure that you have something considering linear phase on the low frequencies. And I probably wouldn't modulate these low bands too drastically or at all if I could avoid it, because when you do that, you're going to create more phasing, and phasing is more noticeable on lower frequencies. So, or it can ruin your mix rather a lot easier with lower frequencies. So I hope this helps. This is how I synthesize kicks. I will be including the serum preset and the vital preset on here. There will be samples of these as well. I hope you can follow along and make your own kicks to use, or if you already know and you're just coming to this video for some kind of reinsurance, I hope I could maybe show you something you weren't already aware of, and you're able to take something away. Yeah, so that's all I got. Leave a comment if you need further clarification or you have questions about what we covered in this video. If you like this or you want to see other things covered, let me know in the comments or reach out to me. I think the next video we'll cover will be snares or other drum hits. And yeah, if you like what you see / hear, click subscribe and there will be more for you. Thanks and have a good day.